Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Julie Moose, Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute, and I am really thrilled to welcome you to Working Through, Revising Your Emotional Story. Welcome to Elizabeth Flock and Lori Gottlieb. Liz is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, author, and documentary filmmaker with a focus on social issues. Her most recent piece was I Was Depressed Before All This, Now What?, which appeared in The Atlantic. And her first book, The Heart is a Shifting Sea, tracked three marriages over the course of a decade to reveal how India is changing. And she just announced the second book, so congratulations, Liz.
Thanks. Hi, everybody.
Lori is a psychotherapist and author of the New York Times bestseller, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which is being adapted as a television series. And in addition to her clinical practice, she writes The Atlantic's weekly Dear Therapist advice column, contributes regularly to the New York Times and many other publications. So we're going to start the conversation between Liz and Lori, and then we'll bring in your questions, which you can start asking anytime in the Q&A queue. So, Lori, I'm going to start by quoting you to yourself from something that you said earlier in the week. You said in a conversation with LitHub, even though my job title is therapist, I feel like my real job is editor. We're all unreliable narrators. We all tell a story from our own subjective point of view. And some of those stories you've been telling yourself have kept you trapped, have limited what you can do in your life. I'd like to kind of start the conversation about the emotional stories we tell ourselves and how we can go about revising them.
Yeah. So, I think that applies so much to every single one of us in terms of the ways that we think about our lives and the stories we're telling ourselves about our lives and how that impacts the way we move through the world. And so I was talking about it in the general sense of when people come into therapy, they very much have stories that they've been telling themselves, like, I'm unlovable, or nothing will ever work out for me, or everyone's life is better than mine. And those stories tend to play into all of their interactions. I think right now during the coronavirus, we tell ourselves a lot of stories too. And part of it has to do with the words that we use for what's going on. So we talk a lot about how we're isolated. And yet, well, first of all, I should say for journalists, we're used to this, a lot of us, right? But a lot of us are using this term like we're isolated as if we're in solitary confinement in a dark cell with no interaction whatsoever. And yet we can interact very easily with other people. We are physically distanced, but we aren't isolated. And I think that changes the way we think about our worlds every day when we wake up. I think when there's uncertainty, like there is right now, we tend to fill in the story with something negative. So we don't generally use that moment of uncertainty to say, I'm going to fill it in with something great that's going to happen. As humans, we don't tend to do that. So I think that the stories that we make up about things that have not happened yet and may never happen can really impact the way we go through our days. And I know you, Liz, also, you and I were talking about this the other day also, and I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, one of the stories that I've been thinking about as a journalist and as a person right now is how perceiving the coronavirus and the social unrest that's taking place right now, that one story I've been telling myself, and I know other journalists I've been speaking to as well, is that what comes after this is bad, that this is all really negative and that our life is going to change for the worst and that our society is going to change for the worst. And I'm an investigative journalist, so I'm drawn to sort of the dark places. But as we've seen in sort of the last few weeks, there's also ways in which our society may be reshaping itself and transforming in positive ways. And I think exploring that kind of frame as a journalist and exploring why you're perceiving it in a certain way and what sort of evidence you have can be really helpful. And I just think, for me at least, when I have this sort of frame that what comes after this is definitely bad, it sort of paralyzes me from doing the work that I want to do. I feel very distracted. I feel like I have to be on Twitter updating myself about every iteration and every change that's taking place so that I can worry about what's going to happen next. And instead exploring the ways that our society could be reshaping itself for the better, and looking at what's possible and exploring, just those different possibilities, I think can also be helpful as a journalist, because our job is not just to explore the dark places, but also to offer potential solutions and look at what's possible. And so, I mean, I think I wanted Lori maybe to address this a little bit more, but there's so much rapid change taking place right now. Every day it feels like our society is moving in such a rapid way. I know if I miss looking at the news for one morning, I feel like things have dramatically shifted, and that can be a really uncomfortable place to be. So Lori, maybe you could talk about just sort of the reactions that people and journalists might feel to just this kind of like breakneck pace of change that's happening in this time.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love what you said about, the story that we're not really covering, which is the story of what are going to be the positive outcomes from something that is really horrible and challenging, right? And so I think that story isn't really getting covered. I think that the story that everybody's following is, all everything that we already know about, right? And so there's so much other stuff going on, but people are almost afraid to cover that other story because they're afraid to think those thoughts themselves. So it's almost like, the pain Olympics or the grief Olympics, where everyone's sort of comparing their pain or comparing their grief to somebody else's. And if they feel like, well, I have a roof over my head and food on the table, so really, my pain, my grief doesn't really, I can't really talk about that. That's part of the problem. The other part is they feel like they can't feel joy. So a lot of people will secretly tell me through therapy, right? Or just friends, saying, don't tell anybody this, but, people are saying like, I'm really glad I don't have to have my hour and a half commute to work every day. Or I'm really glad I got to sit down and read a book for 3 hours. Or I'm really glad that I got to have this long conversation with my friend that I normally would not have. People feel like they can't experience pleasure in the midst of so much pain. And the truth is that the human condition is that they're all mashed together. And I think that we feel guilty or we feel embarrassed by any kind of pleasure that we're experiencing right now. And as much as we're talking about protecting our physical immune systems from the coronavirus, we need to protect our psychological immune systems just as much. And so if all you're doing is inputting all of these things that are wearing down your psychological immune system, you're going to get emotionally sick. And so it's really important to be able to say, I need to also bolster my psychological immune system. And that means really experiencing things that do nourish you, that are healthy for you. And so when we talk about the anxiety that's going on right now, right, we talk about these stories, we also say, the anxiety is bad. Well, not necessarily. There's two kinds of anxiety. There's productive anxiety and unproductive anxiety. And productive anxiety is when you are reasonably worried about something, and so it motivates you to take action in a healthy way. So we're reasonably worried about the spread of the coronavirus, and so we are taking action by distancing, washing our hands, doing all the things we need to do. Unproductive anxiety is what I think a lot of us are doing instead, which is obsessive rumination, what you were talking about, Liz, where, checking the headlines, checking the latest updates, making sure that, every iteration of what's happening. And that really isn't productive because it doesn't make you do something different than you're already doing, right? All it does is feed this piece of you that feels like, oh, what do I do? What does this mean? Then you start futurizing and catastrophizing. It's not helpful in any way. And so I think that when we look at the positives of what's happening, part of our not wanting to do that is that change is hard. And we don't want to give up the familiarity of where we are to go into a place where we might need to do something differently. And so I think that as journalists, we need to be really adaptable. I think that's part of our job description anyway. And so how can we be flexible and adaptable to the changes that are happening and find that there's so many possible positive outcomes. And I see them even happening right now. And so, we need to be able to tell that story, not only to ourselves, but to our readers.
Yeah. I mean, what tools would you give for journalists right now who do have to make consuming a lot of stressful news part of their daily life? interviewing folks and perhaps being affected directly by coronavirus, or, you know, journalists of color having to sort of ingest this news about George Floyd and others, and then also do interviews that can be folks with a lot of trauma, and managing all of that right now. Like, what kind of tools would you say journalists should sort of employ in this time, do you think?
I think there's a lot of overlap between how journalists can care for themselves and how therapists do. So as a therapist, I hear a lot of stuff during the day, right? As journalists, we hear a lot of stuff that maybe is difficult to hear, but we want to get the story and we want to get the real story. And so we're going to hear it and we're going to go there. Same with as a therapist. And so self-care is really important. And self-care is like this word that people toss around, but I think you have to actually practice it. And what that means is making sure that you are doing what you need to do to take care of yourself emotionally. So that might mean you are taking breaks between your interviews. It might mean that you are taking a walk and getting outside. It might mean that you are doing things that you enjoy. You're making sure that you're sleeping well. I think a lot of people on deadline don't sleep when they're on deadline. They don't sleep as well. They forget to eat, or they're eating stuff that's not really, you know, going to be healthy for them. You know, there are a lot of things a lot of habits that we have as journalists, because we're so focused on just like doing the story, meeting the deadline, that we forget that we need to kind of pace things in a way that works for us. And then also take these psychological breaks from what we're doing. You can't do this work and do it well without taking psychological breaks.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. I also think, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like also acknowledging that things are difficult. I think as journalists, we often feel that we need to sort of project this air of having it all perfectly together. I know when I published the piece for The Atlantic, I was worried that no one would ever hire me again because they'd think that, oh, well, this person has depression, anxiety, so they're not going to publish or something like that. But I found that so many journalists reached out to me and said that they were feeling the same way. And I felt that actually just even acknowledging that feeling lifted the burden a little bit.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because both in your piece and in my book, we both reveal so much about ourselves. And I thought if I revealed that, nobody would want to come to me as a therapist again. And you thought nobody would want to hire you as a journalist again. And yet I think we both had the opposite reaction. And so because most of us journalists are working, you know, even if you work at a publication, you know, right now you're probably home, or you have been home for a while. But a lot of the work, even if you work at a publication, you still have time to just work from home or do it when you do it. You're working by yourself. And so I think that we aren't really talking about what's going on with us emotionally. And I think that everybody feels like they have to present. There's this performative aspect to it, I think, because there's so much social media and there's this presentation of, you know, hey, look at my piece. Hey, look what I've done. And everybody feels like everybody else has it all together and they're being so productive. And they don't realize that there's so much going on with everybody and everybody's going through a hard time. And so right now we're in this unique time where we have this universal stressor that normally everybody has their own unique stressors. We have this universal stressor. We have many of them actually right now in the world. And yet everybody's reacting to them in their own unique way. But I think the more we talk about the fact that it's hard, the more it normalizes that. And it's like, you can breathe again. You feel like I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. And that's what I think your piece, Liz, really did was, you know, which was so great, was to say, you know, here's my experience. And it's the both and. It's, I'm going through this depression, anxiety, right? And I'm this really accomplished writer, and here's also what I'm doing. So I think you presented both sides of that, which I think a lot of people can relate to.
Thank you guys so much. This is so helpful. I'm going to ask a question that was posed by Menachem Lecker, who is curious about the journalism ethics of some of what you're discussing. So he says, if as journalists we're hurting ourselves with bad anxiety by following the news compulsively, does that imply that the content we're churning out collectively as the media is giving readers, viewers, listeners bad anxiety too?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think that goes back to the idea of presenting possibilities that we were just talking about. And I know that over the last year, I've seen a different response from readers than the past. of asking me what they can do. People don't really want to read stories and feel hopeless and helpless and like there's absolutely nothing that they can do. I know when I wrote a story for the New Yorker about a woman on trial, I got hundreds of emails, people asking how they could help her and how they could participate more directly in that subject matter and in that, in sort of changing the dynamic that they read about in the story. And so I think, yes, as journalists, we, you know, solutions journalism is something that's becoming more popular and people are a lot more interested in. I think that perhaps, I think having news that just sort of recounts the death toll every day without also providing solutions is not really that helpful. And maybe Julie, you have something more to say about that narrative that we're presenting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, what we were talking about earlier about presenting these, you know, the whole picture of what's going on, as opposed to just, it's almost like, I think in journalism, there's almost like this sheep mentality right now, which is everybody's presenting this one story and different angles. Let's look at this person. Let's look at this person who almost died. Let's look at these people who died. Let's look, you know, like, and that's important. That has to be covered. But I think there are other things. I wrote a piece, I wrote a couple pieces for the New York Times recently about, you know, people are saying to me all the time, your job must be so depressing right now, listening to all these stories of everybody going through so much hardship, and so much suffering and illness and death and everything, and loss of jobs and, you know, the whole package of what people are going through. And I said, actually, no, it's actually, my patients and I are laughing a lot. Not that there's anything even remotely funny about the situation of the world, but meaning everything, it feels like almost everything that feels human to us has been stripped from us. That's the story that's going out there, but that's not the whole story. I was telling a story in one of the New York Times pieces about how a lot of my patients, to get privacy, they're doing their sessions like in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet seat, because that's the only place they can get privacy to talk to their therapist. And this woman, her mother was in a nursing home, and somebody had gotten coronavirus there, and she was really worried that her mom was going to get it and die. She was sobbing, and she accidentally leaned back and flushed the toilet with her elbow. And it was a very funny moment, and we had this beautiful moment together. And at the end of the session, she said to me, you know, everything that we talked about today was really helpful, but what helped me the most was laughing together. And so a lot of what does make us human is still there and still right in front of us, but people aren't really talking about that or writing about that, I should say. So I wrote about that. I wrote about, you know, the connections that we're making sort of on doing online therapy. I've written a lot of sort of more positive pieces, not in a Pollyanna way, but in a way to say there are different angles to this story, and we need to cover all of the angles, because they think we're getting a very sort of you know, singular view of what's going on, and there's a lot more to it.
And just quickly, I think that applies to the protests as well. I think, you know, I've certainly felt some complaints when I've gone to document the protests that they felt like when there was looting and property destruction, the media was all over it. And then now that there were mass peaceful protests, that they were seeing less. And so I think we do have a responsibility as journalists to show these like really peaceful, hopeful protests taking place as well, and those kinds of stories.
I think especially as you talk about kind of untold or buried stories, it's I think probably giving people a lot of good ideas about things they can go right. We have kind of a related question, and it's something that you met from Delia Wexler. So Delia says, I always find myself in my job. I recently left a job, in journalism for reasons of principle, and I don't regret that, but I can't figure out how to cope with my reduced self-image. We've seen many journalists who no longer have that organizational affiliation that they had for lots of different reasons right now. And you mentioned job loss. I'm curious, you know, both on Celia's behalf and in general, you know, what are some of those stories, and how can people start revising them in more healthy and productive ways?
Yeah, the Zoom went out at the beginning. They left their job. Tell me that beginning part again of the question.
For reasons of principle. So she voluntarily, in her case, she voluntarily left because principle.
Yeah.
Other people have left for other reasons.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that happens, especially to people who write, because their bylines are on things, that their identities get wrapped up in what they do. So maybe more than other professions. So sometimes in other professions, you very much feel like, you know, it's part of your identity. But I think because it's so personal, where everything we write belongs to us in a way, that it does become part of our identities. And I think that, you know, I think when you've been doing it for a long time, that becomes less so. That you feel, first and foremost, that you have a voice and you have something to say, and that becomes your identity much more than the byline, the publication, you know, the comparisons that I think are sort of inherent in the writing community. And so, you know, no matter sort of what your situation is, I think that knowing that you have a voice, knowing that you have something to say, knowing that you have something to offer, I think with a sense of purpose, going back to what Liz was saying about like, what can we do? We can really use our voices in a way that can help people to see things in a different way, to change things in society. And so, you know, I think that being part of your identity is important. I think the other piece of it is financial, which is, you know, what happens when so much has happened recently in my own publication at The Atlantic. You know, people were let go. I know that happened at many publications. And so I think, you know, how do we pivot? And for those people who are freelancers, they're maybe more adept at that because they're used to kind of juggling lots of different things and being very creative about how they piece together their careers. But I think for people who were going to, you know, a workplace every day and now they aren't, it's a big adjustment. And I think to really give yourself permission to feel the loss, really give yourself permission to say, this is really hard right now, and I don't know what the future is, but to be hopeful about the future, because there's no reason not to be. And I think we're giving ourselves a lot of reasons to say, well, it's not going to get better. I think in a lot of ways, the world is opening up as opposed to closing down. And I think that we're reinventing the way that we work and how we can work. And I think that will offer us many more possibilities than we had before all this happened.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think like as a journalist, you often feel like your self-worth is by how often you publish or what the most recent thing is you published. And I remember a few years ago, my publisher asked me to give a list of my hobbies for the marketing team or something. And I realized that I had none because all I did was work. And my whole identity was wrapped into being a journalist. And that sort of forced me to think about like, what else am I besides a journalist? And you know, for you asking the question, and for anyone else, you know, who might be straddling journalism and other things, like there's so much more to all of us as humans, right? And I think coronavirus has also forced me to be like, oh, okay, I also like enjoy gardening, and there's also like ways that I can use my journalistic skills to, you know, advise a friend or respond to this moment and have a discussion with a family member. And just because we're journalists doesn't mean that we have to be publishing all the time or that we have to present this face. And I think allowing ourselves to just like be a little more human and take time off, take a full day to just do something else can feel actually like really enlivening and be really helpful for your mental health, and not just feeling like you're always behind and you always have to keep up with someone else.
Yeah. And I would just add that I think that a lot of the times when we talk about productivity and that pressure to feel like you always have to be publishing, I think that right now a lot of people are saying, well, it's hard, I'm very distracted, it's hard to write. And I think that there's a time for writing and there's a time for marinating, right? And if you aren't experiencing something in life, if you aren't taking the time to experience something, you're not going to have something to write, or you won't have something good to write. And so right now, I think everybody's writing, even if they're not putting anything on a page, meaning everybody's collecting these experiences, or they're you know, kind of doing the pre-writing right now. And that's a crucial step in the writing. So if you're just kind of like trying to publish, you might not be putting out something that will be as meaningful or important or resonate as widely as you will later when you've had some time to really sit in your experience, and then later kind of try to make sense of it and digest it, and then put it out there in a way that resonates much more widely.
Ignore that tweet about Shakespeare writing King Lear during the plague, everyone.
So we have a couple more questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So let me just say to those of you who have asked, we will try to share the questions after the program and if there's time to answer them, we'll email you the responses as well. So thank you all for the questions. I'll choose one last one here. And this one's from Michelle Felt. Aside from the grief, uncertainty, and fear that many people feel with regards to COVID, what can you say about coping with and reconciling the new awareness of how vulnerable we actually are, and how incapable, unprepared our government and systems have shown themselves to be? There's a sense of vulnerability and overwhelm. What are proactive steps to promote political and systemic repair and growth?
Where do you want to start?
Well, I'll start with sort of the psychological part of that, which is that I think it's actually really positive that this illusion of certainty is being pierced a little bit. When, in my book, I write about treating this woman with cancer and how she said, at a certain point, she said, like, why does it take a terminal diagnosis for us to realize that we need to live our lives with intention, right? And so I think that what the coronavirus has done is really sort of given us that wake up call of, we do have a limited time here. Life can be fragile. Things are uncertain. And so I think that you can use that to feel overwhelmed and hopeless and crawl into a hole, or you can say, wow, I really want to live with more intention because things are so uncertain. I want to make sure that I'm doing what I want to do and living the kind of life that I want to live. And so I think what this experience has done is it's helped us to kind of see what our priorities are. What are some of the things that that we're not doing right now that we're like, yeah, I don't really miss that so much. I don't need to go back to that because that was a waste of emotional real estate, or professionally it wasn't, it wasn't meaningful to me. Or you can, on the other hand, you can say, what are the things that I'm really having more time for right now, or I'm really noticing that I want to do more of, that I haven't had the courage to do yet? Or now I'm really noticing that these are my dreams, these are my goals, and why have I not pursued them, and what am I waiting for? So I think on the one hand, the fact that we are realizing that, life has a 100% mortality rate, and that's not for other people, that's a good thing, because it helps you to say, what is important to me right now? How do I want to be a person in this world? What do I want to contribute to the world while I'm here? And I think it gives us more focus.
Yeah. And I've also been thinking a lot about control, like what are the things you can control and can't. Like I woke up yesterday and saw that many countries will not be accepting the US in to visit, right? And so I felt like really upset about that, because there's a lot of reporting trips I wanted to take, and who knows when I'll be able to do them. But there's also a lot of reporting that I can do here locally in New Mexico that I've always wanted to do and haven't had time to do, and now I'm thinking about seriously doing. And so I feel like the way, as journalists, we love to control things. I think that actually goes along with the job. Part of writing a story is crafting a narrative and controlling it into this tidy thing that we're presenting to the world, but allowing ourselves, I think, in this time to be a little bit more like take things day by day and focus on the things we can control as humans and as journalists and as writers, and basically like what is possible right now, and what's possible maybe that we hadn't been seeing was possible, like local reporting, that you hadn't been doing, and treating it as a possibility instead of like what's been taken away is something that I'm at least trying to do, and struggling to do a lot of days, but trying to keep focused on. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the whole half hour, for all of the really helpful ways to reframe some of these stories and revise some of these stories. And thank you all for being here with us. We'll send you a link to the video of the program, and we'll also include a survey so that you can give us feedback, so that we can continue to provide you with the types of programs that you want and need. So thank you again to Liz and to Lori, and thank you all so much for being here, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.